Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Kirkman, a professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK, the director of the Banchois Consort, and author of The Cultural Life of the Early Polyphonic Mass, Medieval Context to Modern Revival. We discussed the ecclesiastical and cultural trends that led up to our modern experience of the Kyriale, with its grouping of parts of the Mass Ordinary in 18 sets, plus the Credos and an ad libitum section. Our topic today is a big one, and one for which I'd recommend the listeners do a little more reading. The interview in this episode focuses on ecclesiastical and cultural trends, but there's a lot more to the story if one is interested in details. Olivier Guillou, in his introduction to a three-part series in Études Gregoriennes from 2003 to 2007 on the manuscript sources of the Kyriale, discusses the overall structure of the history of the book, which he describes as tripartite. First, he calls it a prehistory stage in which the constitutive elements of the Kyriale appeared as separate doxological acclamations conveyed by oral tradition, end quote. At the end of this stage, from the 10th century onwards, we see that the orally transmitted chants are written down. Thus, why we see dates like this in the annotation indicating the age of the manuscript on the top right of each chant in the Kyriale. At this time, we see elements of the Kyriale appearing in tropers alongside their tropes, which is why the masses are often nicknamed for their tropes, and in graduals often just as their incipit, especially during Easter. There's a second stage, which he calls, quote, a formational stage in which the Kyriale begins to form in the manuscripts. And these are the first systematic presentations of the Kyriale, end quote. Guillou goes on to describe two ways in which the Kyriale was organized from the 11th through the 13th centuries. Either in lists according to genre, for example, a list of the Kyries, a list of the Glorias, etc., or by grouping them into a mass such as what we're used to now, with the four pieces, Kyrie, Gloria, Sanctus, and Agnus, or even just a group of two pieces, a Kyrie and a Gloria. During this time, the masses also begin to receive a rubrical designation for when they're sung, a liturgical time designation like Easter or Nativity. A common they're used with, like Common of Apostles, Common of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or according to the degree of liturgical solemnity, the class of feast. This systematization was facilitated by the charism and work of the Franciscans, and we discuss this in a particular way in the interview today. Guillou also describes a third stage, quote, of the stabilization in which the Kyriale adopted the modern configuration known to us. And this happened in the 14th through the 17th centuries. He points to the invention of the word Kyriale in this stage in a Franciscan edition from Bruges that appeared in 1499 or 1500. And it included the modern instantiation of Masses 4 and 16, as well as Credos 1 and 4. In 1614, a Medicean edition appears, and Guillou describes it as a sort of prototype for the 20th century editions, complete with classifications according to feast class and the future Masses 4, Mass 9 in part, Mass 11, Mass 14 in part, Mass 15, and Mass 18, as well as Credos 1, 3, and 4. The Parisian Nevers edition appears in 1658, which is a reissuing of the Medicean edition. And this, of course, becomes the famous edition for which the publisher Pustet gained the 30-year publication privilege from Leo XIII in 1869, that is chronicled in the History of Salem and the Vatican edition. Guillou has an important note at this point in his chronology. He says, this relative standardization of the liturgical books should not give any illusions, however. The Kyriale, a traditionally regional repertoire, varied greatly according to the particular churches. The printed graduals of the 17th and 18th centuries are convincing illustrations of this. Even in the 19th century, when the movement of the return to the Roman liturgy began, local melodic traditions were maintained for a long time. It was the Vatican edition in 1908 which achieved, for the first time in the history of the Kyriale, a uniformity on the scale of the Universal Church of the Roman Rite. Let us specify that in the whole manuscript and printed tradition, the Kyriales are generally poor. They are reduced to 6 or 7 masses at most. It is also necessary to be aware that the wide range proposed by the Kyriale of the Vatican is the result of a vast compilation." End quote. It's primarily Guillau's second stage that we address in this interview, and we'll address some of the third stage in episode 3 of this season, an interview with Dr. Harrison Russin. But there's still a small gap in our understanding of the formation of the modern Kyriale, and for that, one needs to go to an article in Revue Grégorienne by Dominique Cotta, though Guillou provides a helpful summary. Cotta's article on the origins of the Kyriale in the September-October 1955 issue of Revue Grégorienne outlines the working method for the formation of the Kyriale in the 1908 Vatican edition. Guillou notes the different organization of the 1908 Vatican edition and the 1895 Salem edition of Potier with a helpful comparative chart in his article, noting that the Vatican edition added some new masses, added Credos 5 and 6, and added a bunch of different pieces in the ad libitum section, as well as redistributing various other masses in a different numbering system. A lot of the sources I'm citing here are not available on the internet, but there is one helpful article on the subject from an Australian liturgical journal available, and we'll link to that in the show notes page. Before we head into the interview, I'm delighted to announce the summer courses of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music for summer 2025. They're available now on catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. Click on summer courses. If you're interested in today's topic, I'd recommend to you in a particular way the Introduction to Gregorian Chant course that I'll teach July 14th through the 18th. It's a systematic overview of Gregorian chant. We cover pneumatic notation, Gregorian modes, ear training and sight reading, vocal technique appropriate for singing chant, and Latin pronunciation. A special focus will be placed on the rhythmic interpretation of the chant according to the classical Salem or Maccaro method. We spend the second half of the class developing choronomy or conducting, and by the end of the week, you'll feel confident in singing most anything from the Graduale, as well as conducting some pieces. The class isn't really a first entree into chant for beginners, but more so for singers who have been singing chant without having had a systematic and thorough overview of all the fundamental principles of chant. I'm also delighted to announce that Dr. Joseph Dyer, a top expert in Old Roman chant and the liturgies of Rome, will present a seminar on Old Roman chant during the week of July 21st through the 25th. There's 7 other classes offered this summer, including some new ones like vocal pedagogy and organ literature. Be sure to check out our website for more information and the application, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. Click on summer classes, and we're happy to offer, again, free tuition for this summer. And now, with that lengthy introduction, let's go on to the interview with Dr. Andrew Kirkman. Well, it's been a couple of seasons, but thank you for being back with me on Square Notes, Dr. Kirkman.
It's great to be here, Jenny. Thanks for asking me.
So a lot of people think about the origins of the polyphonic mass cycle in Machot's Messe de Notre Dame, or even earlier, the Tournai Mass. But could you speak a little bit about what made those masses so important to sacred music history?
Sure. Well, as you know, I wrote a short chapter on this as part of my book, The Cultural Life of the Early Polyphonic Mass. And there I dug into changes that were going on in the 13th century, mostly around the religious orders of, well, the Cistercians, but particularly the friars, the Franciscans in particular, who basically came up with the idea of grouping chants for the Kyrie, Gloria, Sanctus and Agnus and Ite Missa Est, let's leave the Credo to one side for the moment, in cycles, as it were, or what we would think of as cycles, and hence, I think, started this notion of considering these chunks of the ordinary of the Mass as in some way linked. That's not to say, of course, that they were musically connected any more than, in fact, was the case with the Tournai Mass, or, debatably perhaps in the case of the Macho. But it started a process whereby people started to think of them as a unit. And this was done really in the context of a very tight rationalization of the liturgy that was going on at the time between the friars and the papal curia. So there was a process of rationalization, cutting down the extent of the liturgy to a fairly sort of basic core. And I think that this is what this trend to group those items is part of, really.
And when you talk about it in your book, you especially point out the 19th and 20th century scholarship about this, that for 19th and 20th century musicologists, they were interested in looking at this, and kind of what really became a ubiquitous concept in musicology of just thinking about the mass ordinary.
Yeah.
And looking at it kind of like, a coherent musical composition in a style of like a symphony or something. But really, that's not at the origins of why this trend actually developed, right?
Certainly not. No, I mean, there's nothing wrong with thinking about these things in terms of a symphony and so on. I think I got a lot of backs up at the time when I wrote about these things. But my intention wasn't to tell people how to think about this music. It was simply to point out the way it was conceived at the time. That it was about bringing together a single or a singular message in each case. But the aim with doing that was really about particularity, often for individuals and certainly for specified and specific devotional practice and uses, which, and it did indeed result in something that one could refer to as unity, something that involves a common ground moving through each polyphonic setting, each setting of each mass movement. But, the motivations for coming up with that practice, and hence the very particular morphology that it took, were particular to that time.
Right. So let's get into this a little bit with a little bit of back history about the influence of the Franciscans. And they really were a dominant force for organizing and systematizing various liturgical trends of the 13th century. Could you talk a little bit about how the Franciscan charism and apostolate, their actual work, made possible the influence that they had and some basics about what that influence actually was?
Yeah, well, they had a great deal of contact with the Curia. And in fact, we do have Franciscan popes, as you know. And clearly there was a great deal of interest from their point of view in having a liturgy that could be portable for the very obvious reasons that, of course, they were mendicants and they were moving all the time, spreading the faith. So portability was extremely important for obvious reasons from their point of view. But at the same time, the papacy was going through a phase of wishing or trying to get the liturgy down to a more manageable size. One had, of course, a long history by this point of the growth of sequences and tropes and so on that were proliferating the liturgy to an extent that I think they found unmanageable and probably uncontrollable as well. So there were different motivations operating on the two sides, but a great deal of commonality in the results that came from those different needs.
Okay, so the mendicant orders both encompass the Franciscan and the Dominicans, but really the Dominicans had a quite different influence on the liturgy. And so could you juxtapose perhaps the Franciscans to the Dominicans and then maybe, more stable orders like the Cistercians or Cluny?
Yeah. So the Cistercians were also rationalizing the liturgy rather earlier, and their changes, their developments following the Charter of Charity in 1119 were taken over by the Franciscans and the Dominicans in their different ways. I should say that in writing about these things, I'm consolidating very large spans into a rather short space of time, simply just to show a type of particularity that evolved at this time, which then later fed into, or at least facilitated, one might say, the main object of my interest, namely the cyclic mass. But yes, you're right. I think the early stages of change came with Cistercian influence on the Dominicans, and then a very important figure is Jaime of Faversham and his Indutus Planeta, and that's an order of the Mass, which was put together in about 1240 or thereabouts. And that became extremely important and influential. On the other hand, on Roman missals, there was a great deal of interconnection between the papal liturgy and this particular order of Mass instituted by Haimo. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's quite a lot of history on this in this rather wonderful book called The Origins of the Modern Roman Liturgy, although modern might seem a slightly strange misnomer when we're talking about the 13th century, but by Stephen Van Dyke and Joan Hazelden Walker. It synthesizes a lot of material which is otherwise quite scattered and, at least at the time I was writing, quite hard to get your hands on. So with that, the outline of the action of Mass was kind of codified with Haimo's Indus Planeta. And then Franciscan codification of the music came along with their Gradual, which they published in 1251, published in the sense of promulgating, of course, across their friaries. And a large motivation here was, as I mentioned, portability, but another one was the desire to be able to have common worship. If you were moving, if you were itinerant, and you were moving from establishment to establishment, common systems of worship obviously had a premium for that reason too. So you weren't sort of cloistered in one small space and developing your own local practices. The practices were, by their very nature, international and spread across the entire extent of Franciscan practice.
Go to the summit. Join us this summer, July 1st through the 4th, 2025, at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California, for the Fons et Coolman Sacred Liturgy Summit. The summit gathers Catholics who love Christ, the Church, and the Church's sacred liturgical tradition for the solemn celebration of the Mass and Vespers, insightful talks on the sacred liturgy, liturgical formation, and the sacred liturgical arts, and fellowship to build fraternal bonds through which the clergy, religious, and lay faithful can support the Church and one another in their promotion of the sacred liturgy. Speakers and celebrants include Cardinals Sarah, Ranjith, and O'Malley, as well as Archbishop Cordileone, Abbot Benedict from the monks in Norcia, and many others. You'll have a chance not only to assist at the sacred liturgy and hear wonderful speakers, but designed to foster conversation amongst attendees and speakers, the summit's schedule features time for shared meals and conversational fora. The fora, moderated by conference hosts, will engage participants, prelates, and clergy in attendance, and summit speakers in discussion about the practicalities of the promotion of the sacred liturgy and liturgical formation in their parishes and schools. Music for the liturgy will be provided by the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, featuring an all-professional choir from around the country, directed by Professor Christopher Berry and me, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka, the director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, and with the assistance of organist Dr. Aaron James. Affordable housing in the area is available, and the conference registration fee includes many meals. More information is available at liturgysummit.org. Don't miss out on this amazing opportunity to be inspired and empowered to promote beautiful sacred liturgy in your area. The summit awaits you. liturgysummit.org. Right. So let's zoom in now. You've kind of laid the scene for us in a general ecclesiastical and cultural trend, but let's zoom in on the parts of the quote unquote mass ordinary. Because, when we open up modern books from Solemn now, we see the 18 mass settings plus the section of Credos and the ad libitum section. So what did the Franciscans do in their earliest efforts in organizing those particular chants?
Well, what you see is the beginning of them being organized in sequence, so a Kyrie followed by a Gloria and so on, rather than simply being presented in individual liturgies for days of the year and so on. So the idea of having these things put together in as I was saying, as we would think of anyway, the cycles really comes from that time. There are seeds of it earlier, but in terms of it being a general practice, I think we can see that as happening in the 13th century and the Franciscans being at the forefront of that development. And I think although there are no musical connections, namely motivic connections between each of those chant settings. It's fairly clear that over time they became associated, and you'd have a Marian set and so forth, and you'd have sets of chants which would be used together. Sometimes they would be linked in terms of modality. Sometimes you'd have successions of modes that you would go through. But, the idea of having them be part of common liturgical ground clearly comes from this time.
Right. And, of course, some of the sets do have early connections, that for example, I think we can look at Mass 1, the Lux et Origo, and say there are clear connections between those movements and they've existed together for a long time. Or, for example, Sanctus and the Agnus Dei from Mass 18 that really are, in that what are called now their archaic modes and have a very strong musical connection, but kind of.
Yes. Yeah. I think you're much more favored than me with this, Jenny, by the sound of things. Yes, but that's certainly true.
But even beyond those sorts of eventual groupings that were made in this process, there was a liturgical idea behind it, right? So, what effect were they going for liturgically by grouping things?
I think probably wanting to create associations between certain melodies and certain feasts, and those things would be recurring and part of the standard round that was articulated annually in so many other ways. So I think music contributes to choice of text and kinds of devotion, kinds of ritual, kinds of altar practice at the altar and so forth that are also seasonal, use of vestments and so on. So music becomes kind of tied in to that sort of liturgical round, so you know where you are in the year because you know what the tunes are going to be, just as we do today.
Right. Yeah. And there was just such a rich tapestry that the church provided for clerics and religious, but also lay people, that it wove fabric in which they could really understand the flow of the liturgical year, the meaning of the seasons, and the mystery of that was present theologically in the Mass too.
Yes, indeed. I think that's absolutely right. Yes, and having melodies that could be very easily recognized and associated in the minds of worshippers was clearly a valuable thing. It was a way of giving people a sense of belonging, knowing where they were in the liturgical round, and so on. Just as I think we still experience today. I mean, just having come out of the Christmas and Epiphany season, we don't need any special pleading to imagine the potency of that kind of association with melody, between melody and season.
Right. I think this is sort of a rich world that sometimes gets lost on modern people who don't have these things memorized. They open up books and they can enter into them perhaps in books. But when you have things memorized in a particular way, it really gives a flavor or a color to a season, to a feast. I mean, just after so many decades now of singing the Mass propers, I can't think of certain feasts without hearing the tune of the introit or the communion in my mind, and it has a certain flavor. Like I can taste the mode and taste the text almost.
Yes, I love that analogy with taste. I mean, another one is smell and humidity as well. I've been sort of involved in various kinds of VR reconstructions and work with people, and I worked with a guy local to here, who's actually in the University of Warwick, who works with he's actually sort of reconstructed a tannery, including smells and humidity and everything. And we were working on the idea we were going to come up with was bringing together late medieval alabaster and English music from the 15th century inside chapels, and using a little cubicle, as it were, where you could release smells and create humidity and so on, and create light, both artificial and natural. Because I think another thing to add to the evocation that you've just given us, that the different times of the year are characterized by different kinds of light. The sun's at a different level in the sky. And everything comes together, humidity, temperature, light, and so on, to create a sense of a particular season. And music adds to that sense of synergy, I think, in a very potent way.
Yeah. Did these groupings of masses that were being created by the Franciscans, did they take a while to form even within the Franciscans and then longer to disseminate through the Franciscan practice of itinerant liturgies? Or was it pretty compact in its formation process?
I think more the latter than we would probably be inclined to think today. Because when we speak of the publication of the Franciscan Gradual in 1251, bear in mind that Franciscans were traveling widely all the time, and we were talking about a more concentrated liturgy, which was presumably quicker to produce and much more portable because it was in small volumes. So I think that probably these things spread rather more quickly than one might imagine. And when things are enforced by the rule itself, as in this case in 1251, as in the case before that in 1240 with the Indutus Planeta, they would usually taken up in pretty short order. At least that's my understanding.
And so what do you think the connection really was in the mind of someone like Machaut? Do you think he was inhabiting a world dominated by this liturgical organization that kind of made him think about a composition for these parts of the Mass in a coherent way? And, what was the effect on someone early like Machaut, and then perhaps of these chant groupings on later generations of composers?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that Machaut had been deeply imbued with a sense of the belonging of the chants that he used, the Marian chants that he used in that cycle, as we would call it today. I use that word with a certain chariness, I suppose, because, it implies a level of musical coherence or musical commonality that I don't think is present in that work. I know people have argued the toss one way or the other, but certainly not in the sense that one sees in later cyclic masses of the 15th century. So yes, I'm sure he was deeply imbued with a sense of what the Marian tunes would be and how they would appeal directly to the Virgin in the context in which he was setting them and having them performed weekly for himself and his brother's souls, of course, on a Saturday and in front of the altar of the Ruelle. So, yeah, and for Machaut, they would surely embodied this powerful sense of inherence in the Virgin.
What do you think are the other trends, either religious or cultural or compositional, that made the composition of a Mass as a group setting become so dominant in the Renaissance?
Well, an important point that Michel Huglot made about this period was that we were also in a time in which the square French notation, the square notes, were becoming standardized, and they were much easier to read than many of the earlier forms. You also start to find larger books which could be put on lecterns, and so in addition to the memorial and imbuing of tunes in people's minds throughout and associations with the parts of the year that we've discussed, you also had this growth of the visibility of music and it being something that you read, which in turn, of course, facilitates singing on the book and adding extra lines. And Michel pointed out, I think very importantly, that it's this notation that we see in the Notre Dame repertoire, where we see the largest early flowering of a big repertoire of polyphony. So there's paradoxically, perhaps, there's a combination of the familiarity of these things in oral practice with the growth, in a sense, of these things being music as read. And when you're reading music, you can, of course, then improvise simple and often probably not so simple counterpoints against the melodies that are in front of your eyes. And we see evidence of that, of course, in notation in English sources, for example, of Fahrburden sites, where people have simply just put crosses through notes or a third above them, that you're citing in a fifth below, and so on, this kind of thing. So, that is a very clear example of where memory and the legibility of the notes comes together to breed the growth of extra lines in music. So I think one would have to say that the earliest phases were surely improvised. The earliest phases of polyphony were surely improvised. And as things became more complex, or as things became inspired a need for didacticism, you start to see more things being actually notated. So I think that has to be the germ of where this comes from. Of course, in the early stages, you tended to get proper chants and responsorial chants sung much more to polyphony. But I think as time goes on, and as the ordinary items become so central, because of this ordering that we've discussed, you've got a situation whereby it becomes increasingly straightforward for groups of clergy to improvise lines against these notated lines of plainsong.
Do you think there's, in terms of the polyphonic compositions that are being notated and read, there's also a sense of more bang for your buck that if you compose a mass ordinary, it can be used for many classes of feasts. Whereas if you're composing for the proper, maybe it can be used for a certain, for Common of Virgins or Common of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But this has a little bit more mileage.
Absolutely. Well, there's that side of it, but on the other side, of course, there's the particularizing potential that you can get from adding polyphony, because if you narrow down, or if you reduce the scope of the chants that are in general usage, sequences and tropes and so forth, you've got more. I suppose you've got more possibility for particularizing those chants that remain, and there's a desire then that if you've got the same standard chants happening again and again, that you want to elaborate them. There's these cycles repeat again and again, don't they? As things become rationalized or pared down, there's always eventually a desire to sort of add your particularization, add your personalization, add your emblematization, if you like, to what's there in the everyday. And I think that's where we get into the territory of the mass, of the ordinary of the mass, becoming the kind of locus classicus of musical development as you go from the 14th into the 15th century.
This is a thorny question that a lot of singers of Gregorian chant are really interested in. So thank you for helping us contextualize how groupings appeared throughout history and, the influence that eventually became the Vatican Kyriale. But could you point our listeners to other resources for reading about this particular topic?
Yes, as I was mentioning earlier, I spent quite a lot of time digging through Études Grégoriennes and Revue Grégorienne and so forth. And I found some things were extremely valuable as kind of touchstones. And the main one that I mentioned to you earlier was The Origins of the Modern Roman Liturgy by Van Dyck and Walker. I think that's a very handy tool, because it actually then leads you through its footnotes to many other sources that you can explore these questions further. There's also Bonnewell's history. Now, it's basically a history of the Dominican order, anyway, which is a very good sort of standard history. It's quite a weighty one, actually. There's a lot of material there on the questions that I've been discussing. There are various dissertations. I found Sally Roper's dissertation on medieval English Benedictine liturgy very useful, because that was a kind of a stabilizing aspect that showed aspects of the larger monastic movement that were also involved in some of the changes that we're discussing. Also the Compline Marian antiphons and so on, the development of them, which of course also has a great deal of importance in terms of later developments in polyphony. So yeah, that was a very handy tool. But Van Dyck and Walker, I think, is a particularly useful tool for digging into these questions. I don't know really of a lot of material in more recent years, I've tended to burrow in the journals that I mentioned and sort of dig out from there. But as far as I know, there's not a great deal being written at the moment, but I may well be wrong, because it's been about 15 years since I was writing this.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm really grateful that you tackled this topic with us today.
Thank you very much, Jenny. It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.